Good evening and welcome, everyone. As Marcia said, this is the first in our three-part series on social justice sponsored by the Sisterhood of the Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation Anshe Emet Education Committee. Our topic tonight is LGBTQ plus in the Jewish community. Our speaker is Rabbi Victor Appell, who is a rabbi at Temple Emanu-El in Westfield, New Jersey. Rabbi Appell is a native New Yorker, grew up in the Reform movement. In high school, he served as a regional NIFTY president. After working in sales and marketing, Rabbi Appell pursued his lifelong dream of becoming a rabbi. After ordination from Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, he served congregations in Illinois and New Jersey. Rabbi Appell then joined the staff of the Union for Reform Judaism, where over the years he served as the director of small congregations, co-director of the Joint Commission on Synagogue Management, outreach and marketing consultant, congregational marketing director, and editor-in-chief of 10 Minutes of Torah. Most recently, Rabbi Appell served as Reform Community Rabbi and Senior Jewish Educator at Rutgers Hillel. Rabbi Appell's writings have appeared in Achim Magazine, Torat Chaim, 10 Minutes of Torah, Kulanu Handbook, The Gender Gap, and The Still Small Voice, Reflections on Being a Jewish Man. Rabbi Appell, his husband, and their two sons live in Metuchen, New Jersey. Please join me in welcoming Rabbi Victor Appell.
Thank you. Save the applause for later. Thank you very much. It's really a delight to be with all of you this evening. Through my work and just proximity, I've had the opportunity to join in Shabbat worship a number of times at the Highland Park Temple, and I've always enjoyed it. And it's great to see some familiar faces here on this Hollywood Squares setup of faces. It's always nice to see some familiar faces. So thank you, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the lovely introduction. By way of introduction, I'll expand upon that a little bit. Having grown up in the Reform movement in New York City, as Cindy mentioned, I was very active in NIFTY, the North American Federation of Temple Youth, became a regional president of it, and I worked at our Reform camps, similar to the Ramah system of camps in the conservative movement. And while I was in college, I applied for and got a job as a youth group advisor at a large suburban congregation. And I was very excited about it. It was work that I really wanted to do. And somehow, at some point between when I accepted the position and when I was about to start the position, about a month later, someone at the synagogue learned that I was gay. This was in the early 1980s. And as a result, the congregation rescinded the job offer. I was in college at the time, and that sort of altered my career path, because I decided that if the synagogue knew that I was gay, surely if I was going to pursue my dream of becoming a rabbi, then Hebrew Union College would also know that I was gay. And in the early 1980s, Hebrew Union College would not accept an openly gay student into the rabbinic program. There were students there who were closeted, but since this synagogue already knew that I was gay, I saw no reason why HUC wouldn't also know that I was gay. So I chose another career path in sales and marketing. Maybe it's not a different career, it depends on how you look at it. But I then decided to follow my dream, and I became among the first generation of openly gay rabbis to apply to HUC. HUC began accepting openly gay rabbinic students in 1990. And I entered the program 4 years later in 1994 as one of the first openly gay rabbinic students at Hebrew Union College. And I was ordained in 1999 as one of the first openly gay reform rabbis to be ordained. And my first pulpit was in Chicago, where I was the first openly gay rabbi. Um, uh, uh, and at the time when I was ordained, there were rabbis who were on the faculty of Hebrew Union College who would not sign my smicha, my certificate of ordination. And there were congregations with whom I interviewed for positions where when they found out that I was gay, that effectively ended the interview. So that's a little bit about what the landscape was like for openly gay rabbis in the 1990s. Before then, it was in many ways even more challenging for rabbis who were in the closet and lived in the constant fear of being outed, which, depending on where they were in their rabbinic journey, could mean expulsion from Hebrew Union College, the denial of their ordination, or if they were already a rabbi, the loss of a job and a livelihood. And that did happen to two rabbis. So that's where we were just a generation or so ago. But where are we today? And we can begin by asking why we should be concerned with about LGBTQ rights in general, and why we should be concerned about the LGBT community and the Jewish community. And I hope along the way that if you do have any questions, you will please put them in the chat box. I do want to make sure that I am able to respond to as many questions as possible. So even if it doesn't have anything to do with what I'm talking about right now, please don't hesitate to ask the question. So let me begin by giving you a very quick lesson on one foot in gay Jewish history. So while the word homosexual may be a relatively new word, actually first used in Germany in the 1860s, there have always been people who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender, even when there were no words to describe them. Today, I would imagine that just about everyone who is participating in this Zoom program knows or has known someone who is gay or lesbian. At one time, it was perhaps growing up and having the aunt or uncle who never married, or the two roommates in the apartment next door, the coworker who was hesitant to go into detail about their personal life. Today, it could be the two women and their children in the house next door, or our child's best friend, or our child or grandchild. If we care about the people we know, the people in our lives who are gay or lesbian, bisexual, or transgender, then we need to care about their civil rights as well. We need to care that they cannot be fired from their jobs simply because of how they identify or who they love, or that they have the same legal protections that are afforded by the institution of marriage. Now, as Jews, we share a history of discrimination with the LGBTQ community. Whether it was the Nazi Party in Germany or the radical right and white supremacists right here in the United States, Jews and gays have often been lumped together, and both have been targeted and discriminated against. We only had to witness earlier this week the anti-Semitic clothing and t-shirts and sweatshirts that some of the rioters who attacked the Capitol were wearing. I assure you, those same people would just as easily don a garment that was homophobic. Now, for most of history, gay people had no choice but to live closeted lives, often marrying and raising children. By the 1960s, this began to change, and the gay rights movement was launched officially in 1969, though it had been leading up to that for several years. And more people began to come out of the closet. But without the status of marriage and heterosexuality, many found themselves rejected not only by family, but by institutions. And one of those institutions was religion. Gay people were rejected by their churches and synagogues. But some gay people still wanted to be part of a religious community. And even if their religion rejected them, they could not reject their religion. Among those were Jews who, in several cities around the country, began to form synagogues that served gays and lesbians. And here I'll digress for a moment. Around 1975, when I was in junior high school, when I was in ninth grade, our social studies teacher required that we get that all of the students in his class have a subscription to the New York Times. And so each day the New York Times would be delivered to our social studies classroom. Now, if you are a lifelong reader of the New York Times, like I am, you will remember a time when the New York Times was only 2 sections, not the different sections each day. It was 2 sections. And in the second section, if you opened it up, on the first page or two were listings or advertisements of religious services taking place in New York City on that weekend. Mostly churches, all of the big churches, and some synagogues as well, would take out advertisements. I don't think there are any advertisements in the New York Times anymore for religious services over the weekend. But back in the 70s, this occupied an entire page of prime New York Times real estate. And at the very bottom of the page, there was a very small ad for something called the Gay Synagogue. And I noticed this when I was 15 or so, and I wondered, were these gay Jews or were they just happy Jews? It seemed inconceivable or almost too good to be true to me that there would be a synagogue for gay people. By the time I was 15, I already knew that I was gay. I knew that I was Jewish and that was very important to me. And I knew that I wanted to always be both, and that I never wanted to have to sacrifice one for the other. So each Friday, when I would get my copy of the New York Times in my social studies class, I would, as discreetly as possible, open up the New York Times to this first page of the second section to make sure that the ad for the gay synagogue was still there. Because I promised myself that one day I would go there. I didn't know when and I didn't know how, but as long as there was a gay synagogue, it meant for me there was some hope that I could be both Jewish and gay. And finally, when I was in high school, in 12th grade, I made plans to stay at a friend's house. It was Thanksgiving weekend, and I had friends who lived in Manhattan, and I made plans to stay with them, and I went to the gay synagogue. Um, and just for the record, the first time I was ever kissed by a man was at the gay synagogue when someone wished me Shabbat Shalom. So my coming out was at the gay synagogue. So, but that was many years ago. But back to a little bit later, these synagogues, without rabbis, but often led by members who came from more traditional backgrounds, were a lifeline for Jews who did not want to have to abandon their religion because they were gay. And many of these synagogues were founded by people from more traditional backgrounds, conservative backgrounds, Orthodox backgrounds, because there was no place for them in their own synagogues. And so they created places where they could be who they were, where their lives could be celebrated. And so places where they could be both gay and Jewish. And over time, these synagogues thrived. And at one time, most cities with large Jewish populations also had a synagogue serving the gay and lesbian community. And the synagogue in Manhattan that serves the gay and lesbian community, Congregation Beit Simchat Torah, today has become a very large synagogue with over 1,000 members. They are so large that when it's not a pandemic, they have their Yom Kippur services at the Javits Center. But interestingly enough, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, with more and more people coming out, some synagogues, particularly those in the Reconstructionist and Reform movements, began to grapple with questions about welcoming gay and lesbian Jews. Could they be members? What would that mean? Did they have to join as two single people? Could they join as a couple or a household? What if they had a child? Could a gay or lesbian Jew teach in our religious school? And during the height of the AIDS crisis, congregations wondered how they could support members whose sons were sick or dying. So and so this was happening in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and congregations started to started the process of figuring out how to welcome gays and lesbians into their congregations. And gays and lesbians started creating families. And sometimes when you create a family, your priorities change, and all of a sudden, that one-bedroom apartment is no longer big enough, and you're looking for a house with a backyard. And those usually are in the suburbs. And so gay people found themselves moving to the suburbs, often with a baby in tow. And if they were Jewish, they wondered, could they belong to a synagogue in the suburbs? And some of those congregations found themselves with literally gay people at their doorstep asking, can we join? Now, even if many congregations were not ready to think about LGBTQ members in their congregation, their movements were taking stands in the areas of civil rights. Led by the Reform Movement's Religious Action Center, liberal denominations called for the end of the laws that discriminated against gay and lesbian people. In fact, the first proclamation or resolution in favor of civil rights protections for gays and lesbians, one of them within a religious organization was through Women of Reform Judaism, then called the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods. Was one of the first religious organizations to call for equal rights for gay and lesbian people. And over the years, the Reform movement has been leaders in that. In fact, long before the Reform movement, before the CCAR, the Rabbinic Organization of Reform Rabbis, grappled with rabbinic officiation at same-sex marriages, the movement had called for marriage for civil marriage for gays and lesbians. In the Reform movement, it started, the road to welcoming gays and lesbians actually started not within the synagogue, but within the arena of civil law and civil protections. And interestingly enough, to some degree, the conservative movement has followed the same path. The Rabbinical Assembly endorsed the bill known as End of the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. And in 2013, the Rabbinic Assembly supported the Supreme Court ruling in favor of marriage equality. So that's a little bit of the history on one foot of sort of how we got to where we are today. And so I think the question at hand is, how do we welcome those in the LGBTQ community today into our congregations? If that is something that in fact we would like to do, how do we do that? What are the steps that we need to take? Like I said, I hope that if you do have any questions, you'll put them in the chat box. With regard to that, I would say that there are two overarching ideas to keep in mind if we want to make our congregations welcoming to members of the LGBTQ community. One is, people do not go where they think they are not welcome. Number one, people don't go where they think they are not welcome. And number two, people do not want to pay for the privilege of being treated like second-class citizens. Okay? People don't want to be people don't want to pay for the privilege of being treated like second-class citizens. So back to the first, people do not go where they think they are not welcome. The prevailing wisdom among many people is that communities of faith, including our synagogues, are not welcoming to lesbian, gay people, bisexual people, transgender people. They just imagine that these places don't want them. So one of the things that is incumbent upon us, if we do want to create communities that are welcoming, is to make very clear that in fact we are welcoming. And sometimes that puts us in somewhat uncomfortable positions, because many times communities of faith by their nature are very traditional. And we don't always like disrupting the status quo. And sometimes our congregations are willing to say, of course we would welcome anyone who is lesbian and gay, but we would never put that on the website. Or we would never announce it publicly. So people who might be wondering if a congregation is welcoming might never have the opportunity to find out if the congregation is not willing to say that in fact they are. And then people don't want to pay for the privilege of being treated like second-class citizens. So what does that mean? For gay and lesbian people, this often means whether the congregation actually has dealt with this yet or not. Nobody likes to be a test case or the first case. And many congregations don't actually start thinking through some of these questions until someone shows up at their door and says, we'd like to join. And then they're handed an application form that says husband and wife. And So, part of it is about doing some of the work in advance to make sure that we are, in fact, welcoming places. So, someone just asked, what do you do to make them feel welcome? So I think that um, there are a number of ways that we can do that. We can start on our websites by saying, when we talk about membership or about us, that we're an inclusive congregation. We can also say that we welcome members of the LGBTQ community. I think it's very important to name that. Um, uh, when I look at a congregation that in their materials, whether it's written or on a website, say that they welcome non-traditional families, the first thing I say is, oh, they don't have the guts to name it. They're afraid of offending someone, which means that they're going to be more afraid of offending someone than making me welcome. So that's not going to encourage me to be a member of the congregation. Now, lest you think that the conservative movement hasn't already started doing this work, I will tell you that the conservative movement has. In 2013, the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism partnered with an organization called Chesed, which is a Jewish organization dedicated to welcoming younger Jews, teens and young adults into the Jewish community, and did groundbreaking work in religious school curriculum and actually in day schools as well. And what they found back even in 2013, that 80% of conservative synagogues allow same-sex couples and families to join their congregations. 80%. 60% say that they do have openly LGBTQ members. And in 2015, the United Synagogue launched a project with Chesed to train synagogue leaders in making systemic changes to their congregations. So there has already been a significant amount of work done in the conservative movement already. So people have said, shuls should start using welcoming language. You let members quell about their children's marriage if they identify as LGBT. And it's about being proactive than reactive, which is all very true. So the first, one of the questions is, even if we don't think that we have members in our congregation who identify as LGBTQ, and we may not, depending on where we are, depending on the size of the congregation, I think that there are other ways of looking at it a little bit more expansively. So when I was at my first pulpit in Chicago, which had over 700 households, it was a large congregation, I asked the staff there, I said, do we have any gay or lesbian families? And they all scratched their heads and they came up with 2. They thought they had 2. And I thought, okay, but that's a very narrow way of looking at it. Each Shabbat morning, when I would stand on the bima and I would look at the congregation, and almost every week there was a bar bat mitzvah. And in the first row on either side of the congregation would be all of the relatives who came for the bar bat mitzvah, or all of the close friends of the family. And week after week, I would see the gay uncle, the lesbian aunt and her partner, the gay best friend of one of the parents. And I would think to myself, all right, that's a gay family that we have in the congregation. Why? Not that there was a gay member, but I knew that if this family had a close relative who was gay or lesbian, then these issues were important to them, that they wanted to know that our congregation was a welcoming place for people, that our congregation supported civil rights for gays and lesbians and supported things like marriage equality, that they were important to them. So I started thinking that I had a lot more gay families in my congregation than just those two people who everyone knew about. Um, but that there were a lot of families for who these were very important issues. So one of the ways that we can be welcoming is to be proactive. Like I said, we can say on our websites or in our literature that we welcome LGBTQ individuals and families. Chesed, the organization that I mentioned earlier, which is based out of Boston, actually has these stickers that a lot of Jewish organizations and Jewish individuals put on their doors that say this is a Jewish organization that is welcoming and safe and affirming, with a rainbow on it, which is sort of one of the signs of the gay community. You may be familiar with the rainbow flag of the LGBTQ community. So there are ways of really making it making a statement that you do welcome gays and lesbians. Another way, and someone mentioned it already, is, will synagogues mention the marriage of someone, usually the adult child of a member, who's gay or lesbian, if they're marrying someone of the same gender? Um, you know, that's actually that's actually a question that I think most synagogues have resolved at this point in the affirmative, then in fact they will. The place where this is actually a question right now is in some modern Orthodox congregations. Um, so who are grappling with that right now. So that's another thing, would that couple be able to have an ufruf or a blessing before their wedding on the bima? So these are ways that we can think about how we might welcome members who are part of the LGBTQ community. And then there's the whole question of what happens when couples come to us with children. Are we ready to enroll the children of gays and lesbians into our religious schools if we have a religious school? And what does that mean for us? What needs to change if we're going to do that? That might mean thinking very, on one level, again, it's the form. I've, been in synagogues where, while the membership forms have been updated, instead of saying husband and wife, they say spouse one or spouse two. But a lot of times that doesn't get translated into other arms of the synagogue. So no one may have thought within the religious school forms that they needed to be updated as well. And as well, we have to look at curriculum. What happens when in our religious schools we teach about marriage? Do we teach it only about straight people getting married? Or is there an explanation that sometimes people of the same gender also get married? And I think that, one of the other things that we can think about is how we reach out to other organizations in our community. For example, Highland Park has a sizable LGBTQ community. And if we want to be seen as a place that is welcoming, one of the things that we might want to do is think about how we can partner with some of those organizations. One thing that has become very popular in a lot of congregations, especially Reconstructionist and Reform, and I believe in some conservative as well, is a Pride Shabbat, usually in the month of June, which is Pride Month, dedicating one of the Shabbat services to sort of celebrating the gay and lesbian members of the congregation, or doing a lot of education around issues that affect the gay and lesbian community, or how Judaism looks at homosexuality. And I know that one of the biggest issues facing congregations right now is the role of, or how do we welcome transgender people into our congregations? That's something that is something that many congregations are starting to think about a little bit more. Many congregations feel like they've already thought very thoughtfully about welcoming lesbians and gays, both as singles, as couples, as children. And, one of the new frontiers for organized religion right now is thinking about the transgender community. And the Reform movement ordained the first transgender rabbi, I think in 2006 or 7. And I don't know if there are any trans-identified rabbis in the conservative movement at this point. Though, just for the record, JTS in 2007 began allowing openly gay and lesbian people to apply to the seminary. And the first openly gay or lesbian rabbinic student was accepted in 2008. And since then, they have been regularly ordaining gay and lesbian people as rabbis and cantors within the conservative movement. But now we're thinking about how do we welcome transgender people, especially when we have transgender people who, while they're in our communities, transition. How do we celebrate them? How do we recognize them? Very often that means they're taking on new names, and that may include a new Jewish name as well. Very often it means a desire to ritually mark the occasion by going to the mikveh. And it should not surprise you that these days, increasingly, we find ourselves where we are encountering children who are identifying as trans or as non-binary. I know that for years in the Highland Park School District, there have been children who identify as trans or non-binary. And that presents some interesting questions in traditional communities where we often see things along gendered lines. And the question then becomes around bar or bat mitzvah. What do you do with a 12-year-old who does not identify as either a girl or a boy, or who has or who is transitioning, or who identifies as non-binary? So that has kind of forced us to be very creative in how we think about children in our community, especially children who don't identify in ways that we previously considered to be traditional ways. And another issue I know that's very important to thinking about, what everyone thinks about, is Jewish identity in interfaith couples. That's for anyone who is in such a relationship or who has a child who is in such a relationship. You know that interfaith relationships present a whole set of challenges. Will there be one religion in the household? And how will children be raised? And what happens when those children are exposed to non-Jewish relatives and their holiday celebrations? And these are the same things for gay and lesbian families with children. It's no different. Maybe in some ways it's exacerbated a little bit more. There may be a higher rate of interfaith relationships in the gay community. I'm not sure, but those issues are the same, really, for both straight families and gay families. Someone asked me to please describe the ceremony for accepting the adult role. That was from Marlene. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what you mean, Marlene. Um,
Or
bar bat mitzvah, right. So thank you. So for bar bat mitzvah, these are very gendered terms. And for those students, for those children, they don't want to be forced to use bar or bat mitzvah. So we've been thinking about usually b'nai mitzvah, which is the plural, which if you're a grammarian, that rubs you a little bit the wrong way, in the way that now we often use the word they for non-gendered, for people who don't want to use he or him. They has now become a preferred pronoun, even when it's referring to an individual, not in the plural sense. So it's sort of the same thing, doing it in Hebrew as well, b'nai mitzvah. And then there's, what do we, um, you know, the terminology that we use when we call someone to the Torah is gendered. So it's also thinking about that. And, developing some non-gendered terminology. And there are linguists in Israel right now actually grappling with that, trying to figure that out, in part because Hebrew itself is a gendered language. We forget one of the advantages we have in English is that not a lot of our words have an intrinsic gender. In Hebrew, almost every noun has a gender, so it's a little bit more challenging in Hebrew, but it's not insurmountable. It just means being a little bit more creative. Um, and so Felicia wrote about someone wrote in about trans issues, and I think that many of us from a certain age, of a certain age, might have been more familiar with terms like transsexual or transvestite. And those were words that were much more common. And now transgender is the more current terminology, and often shortened to just trans. Increasingly, as I said, children are identifying at younger ages as trans. And so this is becoming more and more of an important issue. Our schools are already dealing with this. Even our elementary schools are dealing with this, and it takes a little bit of education to think about learning how to use language in a different way very often, or not assuming that we even know someone's gender. Not everyone looks gendered in the way that we're expecting it. And it means thinking a little bit more openly about this. And for many of us, it means sometimes being able to kind of uh, get used to being not always as sure of everything as we think we are, especially about other people. Sometimes it's, learning about the trans community has very often taught us to be a little bit slower to assume that we can make certain judgments about people, and being a little bit more open to being surprised. So I've tried to address a lot of things in our time together, but I want to make sure that I address any questions that people have. I haven't touched really on um, uh, rabbinic or Torah texts, which I know for some people are very important. I'm happy to address that, but I want to make sure that I get to what people are interested in. Um, right, so that's someone raised the question about, speaking of gendered terminology, Sisterhood and Men's Club, and those are definitely questions. What do we do with uh, terms like men's club or brotherhood, those are by nature gendered. And I don't think that we have to rush to throw those out. Um, I think that there are definitely needs for people who identify as women to be together and for people who identify as men to be together. Those serve very important purposes for our congregations. Um, though some congregations, have seen that over the years, sisterhoods and men's clubs or men's federations or brotherhoods, whatever terms they use, have grown a little smaller over the years. And especially these days appeal less and less to younger members. Um, and I don't know this has so much to do with the fact that they are gendered. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that younger families are busy raising children. Our work is 24/7 now, thanks to the computer, thanks to email. And those families often just don't have the time to be involved in a lot of extracurricular activities. We find that those younger members of congregations aren't showing up for adult ed either very often. They're not coming to shul on a regular basis. So I don't think that the days of the men's club or the sisterhood are over, or that we need to rethink about those names. Some congregations have done away with them and have gone to creating couples clubs instead. So that's one option, but I think that there's still a place for them. And Rutgers has, Rutgers being such a large university, and New Jersey being such a diverse state, Rutgers University has a very large LGBTQ community, and within Rutgers Hillel, there is a group called JAX, Jewish and Queer, that has been around for many, many years as a strong part of Hillel, and has at Hillel at Rutgers been a very important place for students who, many of whom are, once they're on their own, are starting to think a little bit more about their gender identity and their sexuality, and especially at Rutgers with such a large Orthodox community, having a space for students to be both gay and Jewish has been vital. Over the years, JAX has been a very important place for some of our students who come from much more traditional backgrounds, including Orthodox, and who have grappled with their sexuality. It has become a safe place for them to start working through those issues and trying to figure out where they can find a community that is right for them. And certainly for someone who is Orthodox and identifies publicly as gay, that's a huge challenge, much more so than in other Jewish communities. But I think that there are, in terms of one thing I will say is that I've been very fortunate in having very good relationships with rabbis across all denominations. The nice thing is that I found that whether I was when I started my rabbinic career in Chicago and here in New Jersey, I have found that I've had very good relationships with my Orthodox rabbinic colleagues, and have always been treated very well by them, and have never felt any sort of discrimination. And in all of my work, I've always been in rabbinic organizations where I worked with rabbinic organizations that are jointly that jointly serve Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox rabbis. And I've always found these to be very collegial and great opportunities for Orthodox rabbis to get to meet someone who is openly gay and Jewish and a rabbi, and hopefully, to be a resource to them, because very often in their communities, they have people who do seek them out because they're working through their own issues of identity or sexuality. And very often, even though I'm not an Orthodox rabbi, they've referred those people to me to talk a little bit with them about trying to find ways that they can find a place for themselves in the larger Jewish community. It's not always so easy, but it's definitely in many places, especially in a large urban area like ours, it is doable. And I think that there are a lot of great resources out there for congregations that are trying to think through this. Chesed is a great organization. I highly recommend them. Their trainings are really excellent. And to look within United Conservative Synagogue. I think there are a lot of resources there. And I also think that one thing that might be an opportunity for the congregation to think about is also to work through some of the textual issues around being gay or lesbian in the Jewish community. What do we do with the text from Leviticus? What do we do with the many rabbinic texts that came after that? Those are important things for congregations to grapple with. And there are a lot of great scholars, and no shortage of them in the conservative movement, who have really thought through this and done really important research in this. And the conservative movement has been grappling with this for a number of years. And has really done remarkable work, and has really moved to think about what is the halakha around this, and how do conservative synagogues authentically welcome gays and lesbians in ways that not just about being welcoming for the sake of welcoming, but really grappling through these and thinking about this. And it really is. It's a great opportunity for Tikkun Olam. One of the things that we can be thinking about is that ultimately we're all created in the divine image, right? And that's sort of the starting point for a lot of synagogues in terms of thinking about how do we welcome people into our congregations. And that can lead to a really interesting exploration of both the texts that are in Leviticus, as well as all of the Talmudic and rabbinic texts that came after that, and really thinking about what does this mean, and how do we understand the text, and do we really understand it correctly? Because if you ask a lot of rabbinic scholars, not necessarily rabbis, but scholars of ancient text, to interpret our verses that we look at from Leviticus and even Deuteronomy, and you'd be surprised at how they understand these texts, maybe a lot differently than many of us do, unless we've had the opportunity to really study them, especially in context in the way that they have. So I think that for a lot of people, that's a great next step to think about in terms of where do you take this, so that everyone can be feeling like welcoming the LGBTQ community is not only the right thing to do, but also an authentic thing to do. and that it is something that um, uh, is not asking a synagogue to turn itself into a pretzel in order to do, right? Not to twist itself into something that it's not, but that this is something that is first a really strong part of what Tikkun Olam is all about healing the world, but also about um, not looking at a lot of our tradition through the lens of emotion, but through the lens of academia. And if we look at it that way, and JTS is one of the premier schools of Jewish thought in the world today. And if you look at the work that JTS has done around this, I think we realize that if we approach this from a very academic perspective, we come up with a very different response than if we are only looking at this through a very traditional slash emotional lens. Um, so, with that, any other questions or comments?
Such a quiet group.
The Sisterhood gave me a very tall order to answer a lot of questions, and I tried to do my best. But I'm more than happy to, if there's something that I haven't broached, I'd be more than happy to do so.
Which direction do you feel that it's going in?
Um,
Forward, I hope.
yeah. I mean, I think that we have seen definitely there's been a political backlash that has impacted the LGBT community over the last several years. But I think again, with a new administration coming in, I think we're going to see a lot of that change. But I do definitely think that by and large we're moving forward, and we're moving forward in the Jewish community. Like I said earlier, a lot of these questions, that we never thought, for example, that the Orthodox community would grapple with, they are grappling with. There are liberal Orthodox communities that are ordaining women now, and giving women greater roles of leadership. And I think that we're going to see a welcoming, a new attitude toward welcoming gays and lesbians, even if it sometimes takes a step or two backward before it goes forward. The liberal Orthodox yeshiva, YCT in Riverdale, was set to ordain an openly gay man. And unfortunately, there has been a change of administration there, and they took a step back from that. Fortunately, he did get private smicha in Israel. But I think that we're going to see some of the and we've definitely seen at YU, if not amongst the administration, amongst many of the students there, a desire to start having more dialogue around issues of welcoming the gay and lesbian community within the Orthodox community. So I don't know that liberal Orthodoxy is having a huge impact in Israel on chipping away at this, but I do think that there are some, independent liberal Orthodox communities in Israel that for years and years have been welcoming gay and lesbian Jews, sort of under the radar. But I think those are important first steps, and I think that we're going to see that happen more and more. And Jewish summer camps, that's a great question. If there's still a segment of Jewish life that is very gendered, it's summer camp. And I know that in the Reform movement, we've been grappling with this. At one of our camps in Pennsylvania, Camp Harlem, it's one of the Reform camps. It's sort of divided into boys camp and girls camp. and the kids aren't all together until they get to senior camp, which is like, I think, going into 10th grade. And so the question is, what do we do with that? You know, we're at some point gonna have to figure out new names for boys camp and girls camp, because we already, and some of the reform camps, I don't know if this, I'm sure it's happened to Camp Ramah, but some of the reform camps have already been dealing with transgendered kids in the bunks. And usually it's a conversation with all of the families of the kids who are going to be in that bunk. But you know what? We might think that that would be the most earth-shattering thing, but to a bunch of 12-year-olds, it's no big news. And they're perfectly fine with it. And they roll with it. And there's, 10 boys and one trans kid in their unit or whatever it might be. And they're also, grappling with ways of, like I said, camp is very gendered. Boys sit at one table at lunch and meals, and girls sit at another. And they're, I actually am on the committee at Camp Harlem that is starting to think about how do we deal with all of this, and that those are big issues. But we're gonna figure it out. Kids are amazingly resilient and often much more creative than we are. And I think that it's great that your membership application now says adult 1 and adult 2. And I think that those are every step is an important step, and every step builds and makes it easier for the next step. And I think that part of or a next step is trying to kind of involve the leadership of the congregation, including the rabbinic leadership of the congregation, and getting a sense of where they are on these issues. And sometimes you might be surprised, or sometimes there's some wiggle room. When my husband and I had our Jewish wedding in 1999, we wanted to be married in a synagogue. That was very important to us. And we wanted to be married in a synagogue that we had a connection to. And both of us had been teachers at a synagogue in Park Slope, a Reform synagogue, Beth Elohim. And the rabbi there at the time, who's now the Rabbi Emeritus, we weren't even sure how he felt about same-sex marriages. But he knew both of us. He knew me especially. And I called him up and I said, we want to get married at your synagogue, but we don't want you to do the wedding, which was not insulting to him, but it let him off the hook. What we wanted to do was we wanted to use the chapel, and we wanted our reception there, and we were going to bring in a rabbi and a cantor to officiate at our Jewish wedding. And for that congregation, it turned out to be a great opportunity because they got to have a same-sex wedding, and the rabbi didn't have to grapple with whether he would officiate or not. So, but ultimately it did, I think, help move the dial or move the needle a little bit. And now Congregation Beth Elohim has an openly lesbian rabbi. So I don't think her officiating at same-sex weddings is an issue. But I think that so each step does build on the next step. And is there an issue for Reform rabbis regarding officiating at weddings for same-sex couples? There is not. I think it was around in the year 2000 or so, the CCAR, which is the Reform equivalent of the RA, decided that rabbis could make their own decisions as whether they would officiate at same-sex weddings or not. At the time, they were not ready yet to equate or use the term kiddushin, which is the term that we use for marriage in Judaism. They were not ready to extend the term kiddushin to same-sex marriage. But a few years later, they did go back and say that both marriages between a man and a woman and marriages between two people of the same gender both could be kiddushin. So it's not an issue for Reform rabbis. I'm sure there are some Reform rabbis who don't officiate at same-sex weddings. I would imagine it's very few. And I'm going to guess that it's mainly some of the older rabbis, maybe rabbis who just never had the opportunity to be asked to officiate at one. But I would say that now I would say that almost all Reform rabbis would officiate at a same-sex wedding.
Rabbi, there's some questions that I'm noticing that, so there's one question here. Who is your, we could honor more gay Jewish icons. And the question is, who is your favorite?
Well, one of my favorite is Harvey Milk. Who you may know, he was the San Francisco city supervisor who unfortunately was assassinated. But he's definitely one of my favorites. I think that there have been a lot of people, blanking on all of their names right now, who've been very active in the AIDS movement, who are both Jewish and gay. Larry Kramer, even if they did not necessarily always embrace their Judaism, they were Jewish, and I think that had a lot to do with that, with who they were, and with their activism. So I would say that they count as some of my favorite gay and Jewish icons, but there are no shortage of people who can be honored if that's what a congregation or an organization was thinking about doing.
Another question we have is, looking back 30, 40 years, could you have imagined where we are today?
No. I sometimes am amazed. I'm 60 years old, and did I ever think I would be married by a rabbi in a synagogue? I don't think I could have imagined that. Did I ever think I'd be a parent raising two children? Did I ever think that? Probably not. And when I entered HUC, they basically said, well, we'll ordain you, but we don't know that anyone will hire you. And I never imagined that when I was ordained in 1999, that I would have had a choice of several congregations to serve. I never even knew that I would ever serve a congregation, let alone a large suburban congregation. I always thought, if I got a congregation, they'd be knocking on death's door and were grateful for anyone who would show up. But, little could I have imagined how things would have changed. I never probably ever expected to be able to be legally married. The things that have happened in the last 30 years have completely amazed me. And I think that fills me with hope, even when I sometimes see us as a society maybe taking a step backward. When I'm frustrated by sometimes the pace of some things and the way they move, I look back on that. I look back at that arc of my life, or at least the arc of the last 30 or 40 years, and I am continually amazed, both in terms of my own personal life and of where the acceptance of gays and lesbians in society has gone to today. When you look at how much a part of gay and lesbian culture has become mainstream culture. All of the personalities on TV who are openly gay or lesbian. We're going to have our first openly gay member of the cabinet, in 10 days. And so when I look at all of that, I'm truly amazed. I'm truly amazed by how things have progressed. I'm very grateful for it.
Any other questions out there that anyone wants to ask? All right.
Well,
Well-
Rabbi, you have managed to maintain this audience.
Well, I want to say thank you so much on behalf of the congregation, on behalf of Sisterhood, for your very informative, educational talk and a lot of ideas that you've thrown out and possibilities for us to do things, to move things along, chip away at some of our old ways of thinking, and start to become more authentically welcoming. So thank you again, Rabbi.
My pleasure.